There are stories that emerge as an unexpected confession, laden with memories that defy explanation, but leave a profound mark. This one, in particular, begins with a return to the comfort of home, a reconnection with roots, and the calm of a cherished place. But amid the conversations and routines, something began to surface, something elusive and in some way seemed to demand attention. Good evening, Dom. I want to share an experience I had a few years ago, something that still leaves me thoughtful and at times unsettled. My name is Augusto and I'm 35 years old now. The story I'm about to share happened several years ago, back when I was still in university. I decided to take advantage of the summer break to escape the fast pace of the city and visit my parents in the countryside. I was exhausted and needed to clear my mind. Moreover, I missed my childhood friends deeply and hoped they would also visit the village so we could plan something together. On that occasion, I chose not to inform my parents about the visit. I simply bought a bus ticket and left in the morning. The distance between the city and the village was considerable. The journey took about 8 hours. By the time I arrived, it was nearly 6 in the evening. From the station, I took a taxi straight home. My mother almost lost her breath from the surprise when she opened the door, but her happiness at seeing me was evident. My father was also pleased, though he was more reserved in showing it. It had been over a year since my last visit. I only realized how much I missed the village once I returned. That night's dinner was a true feast for the soul. We talked for hours about my life in the city, the challenges of university and what had changed there. Among those in the house, Rafaela seemed especially emotional to see me again. She had been working with my family for 5 years and was someone my mother deeply trusted. When she saw me, she hugged me tightly and said, her eyes shining, "It's such a joy to have you here again." Something I noticed was the presence of another person helping Rafaela, a young woman who seemed to be about my age at the time. I had never seen her before, but she quickly caught my attention. While they were clearing the dishes, I observed her discreet movements. Rafaela, noticing my curiosity, hurried to introduce us. "This is Amanda." She only offered a shy smile before returning to her work. Amanda seemed reserved, almost invisible in her movements. After finishing everything, she left the room without saying much. That same night, I asked my mother how Amanda had come to work there. My mother explained that her story was somewhat complicated. Amanda was Rafaela's niece. Her mother had passed away a few months earlier, and Rafaela had taken responsibility for the young woman, bringing her to work alongside her. According to my mother, Amanda had faced many hardships and initially struggled to adapt. Over time, however, she began to feel more comfortable with the family, though she still maintained a reserved and anxious demeanor. We didn't delve into many details that night. After chatting a bit longer, we went to rest. In the following days, I made the most of my time reconnecting with friends. I went out with a childhood friend and later met up with others from high school. Occasionally, I would cross paths with Amanda in the house, usually while she was cleaning. She came by about 4 times a week, and it was inevitable that we'd bump into each other in the hallway or while I was relaxing in the living room. As I mentioned, Amanda was very reserved. She never initiated conversations and avoided looking directly at me. I didn't expect anything different from her, but sometimes the situation felt a bit awkward since we didn't even exchange simple greetings. I admit she caught my attention. She was very beautiful, with long hair that reached her waist. On some occasions, I overheard her talking to Rafaela, and her voice sounded cheerful and full of life. Still, I avoided any interaction that might make her uncomfortable or uneasy. As the days went by, I decided not to dwell on it too much and continued focusing on spending time with my friends. One Friday afternoon, while my parents were out shopping, I stayed home. The night before, I had been drinking with friends and woke up late, around 2 in the afternoon, with a pounding headache. I got up and went straight to the shower. Afterward, I headed to the kitchen to find something to eat, and to my surprise, I ran into Amanda. I greeted her. "Good afternoon." She responded, and it was the first time we exchanged words since I'd arrived. I started searching the cabinets for something to eat, but didn't find anything. Perhaps noticing this, she asked, "Would you like me to prepare something for you?" I declined, saying I could have something from breakfast. That's when Amanda explained that nothing had been prepared since my parents had left early. I ended up asking her to make something simple because I didn't want her to spend too much time, especially since I wasn't very hungry. A few minutes later, I returned to the kitchen, drawn by a delicious aroma. I sat at the table and tasted the food, which was incredibly flavorful. I asked who had taught her to cook, and after a brief pause, she replied that she had learned from her mother. That comment reminded me of her mother's passing, so I changed the subject to avoid making her uncomfortable. Shortly after, she mentioned that she needed to leave because she had a lot of work to do. I asked about Rafaela, and she explained, "Rafaela went out to run some errands, and after that I went to the living room to rest for a bit. My headache was subsiding and I ended up falling asleep on the couch. I don't know how long I slept, but I was abruptly awakened by the sound of something breaking. I got up, still groggy, and realized the noise seemed to be coming from one of the rooms. I walked down the hallway and saw Amanda standing at one of the doorways, looking inside with a tense expression. As I approached, she turned to me, visibly startled, her face pale. I asked, "What happened?" At first she hesitated to answer, looking disoriented. I glanced into the room but didn't see anything or anyone there. Amanda followed me inside, as if she was still searching for something. Her expression remained confused and her hands trembled slightly. I asked again, but she just looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. I decided not to press her and said, "It's okay, you don't have to tell me if you don't want to." She stared at me for a moment and, almost whispering, said she had seen a woman in the room. She described the woman as having very dark skin, standing in the corner by the wardrobe. Amanda explained that she had been cleaning the nightstand, and when she looked up, she saw the woman staring at her intently. That's what had made her drop the lamp, now shattered on the floor. I found it odd. I opened the wardrobe to check, but as expected, there was nothing there. Although I could imagine it was just her imagination, her expression left no doubt. She was genuinely terrified. I suggested leaving the mess for later, but she insisted on cleaning up the broken pieces immediately. I stood by the door, watching as she finished, and then accompanied her to the living room. I tried to reassure her. "How about going outside to clear your mind? Maybe the stress is affecting you." Amanda, still visibly shaken, kept glancing at the corners and windows, as if expecting something to suddenly appear. To distract her, I asked, "How has it been for you working here?" She started to answer that she was fine, but it was evident she couldn't focus. The conversation didn't last long before she announced, "I'll go to the garden for some air." That situation left me intrigued. What could Amanda have seen? Her reaction seemed to indicate something truly frightening. The next time I saw Rafaela, I took the opportunity to ask about Amanda's behavior. I recounted the incident, emphasizing the panic she had shown. Rafaela, who was cooking while I leaned against the fridge, seemed visibly uncomfortable with the topic. After a pause, she explained, "Since Amanda's mother passed away, she started having visions. She usually sees the same figure, a woman with dark skin who appears to her. Rafaela told me that in the beginning everything seemed normal when Amanda moved in with her, but as the weeks went by, the girl began waking up scared in the middle of the night. It got to the point where she couldn't stay alone anymore, such was her distress. Unsure of what to do, Rafaela considered taking her to a healer or someone who could perform a spiritual cleansing, believing it might be bad energy causing the nightmares and visions. However, Amanda always refused, insisting it would pass soon. Despite this, Rafaela believed the episodes were only getting worse over time. She noticed that Amanda tried to hide how much she was affected, but the signs were clear. What Rafaela told me lingered in my mind. I felt compelled to observe Amanda more, imagining how difficult it must have been for her to deal with all this, especially surrounded by people she didn't know well. Perhaps she lacked the confidence to open up and reveal what she was truly going through. One afternoon, while I was in the kitchen, I noticed Amanda in the backyard. The garden was usually cleaned every 2 weeks, and this time it was her doing the task. As I looked through the window, I saw her kneeling near some flowers, but I noticed something curious. Amanda kept glancing at one corner of the garden, as if something was catching her attention. I looked in the same direction, but saw nothing except a small bush. Still, she continued staring at that spot, as if trying to make sense of what she was seeing. At dinner, something similar happened. While Amanda was clearing the table, I noticed her gaze fixate on a corner of the living room, as if she saw someone standing there. However, there was no one in that spot. She seemed tense and restless the entire time. This made me believe she truly saw something no one else could. Could it be the visions Rafaela had mentioned? I didn't know how to approach the subject with her, so I let time pass without directly addressing it. One day I walked into the kitchen and heard Amanda quietly crying. I asked, "Do you need help?" She quickly tried to hide it, wiping her tears as she washed the dishes, and replied, "No, I'm fine." At that moment, I started thinking that maybe Amanda was dealing with some psychological issue. I didn't know exactly how she had lost her mother, but I imagined it might have been traumatic and left deep scars. Even so, I knew I wasn't the right person to try to understand something so complex. I tried to approach her subtly, but Amanda kept her distance and seemed unwilling to accept help. I didn't want to be insistent or invade her space, so I thought it best to let Rafaela be the support she needed. I was about halfway through my vacation when, one night, I went out with my friends. We took one of their cars, drove around the village, and eventually stopped at a lookout to talk. We drank quite a bit, and by the time they dropped me off at home, I could barely keep my balance. One of my friends even offered to walk me to the door, but I refused. I spent some time fumbling with the key before finally getting inside. Once inside, the house was unusually cold, colder than outside. I walked toward my room, but as I passed the hallway, I thought I saw a shadow in front of one of the doors. I quickly turned my head, but there was nothing there. I laughed to myself, thinking it was just the alcohol playing tricks on me. I went into my room and collapsed onto the bed. Shortly after, I started feeling nauseous and rushed to the bathroom. I spent several minutes there, kneeling beside the toilet, feeling awful. The bathroom had a sink and shower, separated by a translucent blue sliding door. After throwing up, I remained sitting on the floor, trying to recover. The room was cold, and as I tried to stand, I leaned on the toilet. It was then that I caught a glimpse of a shadow near the shower. I was so startled that I nearly lost my balance, but I steadied myself on the toilet. When I looked directly at the shower, there was nothing there. Even so, a chill ran through me, as if the alcohol had instantly worn off. What I had seen appeared to be the silhouette of someone on the other side. I don't know how I managed to sleep after that, but in my mind, I preferred to believe it was just the alcohol playing tricks on me. The next morning, I asked my mother if she had been awake when I arrived home. She said no, that she had been asleep for hours and wanted to know why I was asking. I avoided giving details, saying it was just curiosity. As the days passed, an inexplicable unease grew stronger. It started as a strange feeling, but soon escalated into something more tangible. Repeatedly, I encountered a dark silhouette. The first time was in the bathroom when I returned home drunk. Then it began appearing in other rooms. Often, while I was on my phone, I would notice movement out of the corner of my eye between one room and another. But when I looked directly, no one was there. On some occasions, I even inspected the rooms, but they were always empty. It's hard to describe exactly. At times, the figure seemed like just a black outline shrouded in something like smoke. Other times, it was clearer, almost as if it were a person. I never saw it fully. It was always quick glimpses. Around the same time, Amanda stopped coming to the house. When I asked Rafaela about it, she told me the girl was very ill, with a high fever and no strength. According to Rafaela, Amanda had already seen a doctor and was taking medication, so she would likely recover soon. But a nagging thought wouldn't leave me alone. For some reason, I felt that what I was seeing was connected to whatever was troubling Amanda. I wasn't sure if I should share this with Rafaela. Something told me the two things were linked. When I tried to learn more about Amanda and what she was going through, Rafaela was evasive, which only deepened my unease. I thought a lot about Amanda's condition, recalling how she always seemed on edge, as if someone or something was constantly near. The feeling was unsettling, and imagining that I was experiencing something similar filled me with fear. One night, while lying in bed, I tried to relax by listening to music. My bedroom door was open, and I was absent-mindedly staring at it as I drifted off. That's when I saw it clearly. The silhouette passed through the hallway right in front of me. My entire body froze, and I held my breath. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and ran to the hallway. It was around 11 at night, but there was no one there. I went to the living room and found my mother watching TV. It couldn't have been her. She was wearing white, and what had passed by my room was entirely black. Noticing my state, my mother asked, "What happened?" I described what I had seen. Although it was a brief moment, I was sure it was the same figure that had been haunting me. Concerned, my mother fetched a rosary that had belonged to my grandmother. She handed it to me and said, "Sleep with this, and if something happens again, pray the Lord's Prayer." Then she added, "If you want, you can sleep in my room." I hesitated to accept, but my fear was greater. Her presence reassured me. Even so, in the following night, sleep became a problem. Lying down was torment, and the sensation of being watched persisted. I began closing all the doors in the house, convinced that at any moment something or someone might peek through them. Whenever my eyes fell on a window, I felt as though something might appear on the other side, maybe a face. This kept me constantly on edge. Before going to sleep, I developed a ritual. I closed the bathroom door, locked my bedroom door, and covered the window with a sheet to block any view from outside. My mother, worried, once came into my room with a small bottle of holy water, sprinkling it around the room while repeating, "You are not welcome here. This house belongs to a family that believes in God." But instead of calming me, this only heightened my anxiety. I feared the presence tormenting me might become angry at her actions. One early morning, I woke up abruptly. My throat was dry and swallowing was painful. The room was enveloped in darkness, as the sheet on the window blocked any external light. Soon I noticed something even stranger. The light which I had left on was now off. I decided to get up to drink water and turn the light back on, but as I moved in bed, I felt a weight beside me, as if someone was sitting there. That part of the mattress was sunken, and when I turned to look, I bumped into what felt like a body. The contact was cold, a chill that seemed to come from within. My trembling hands moved hesitantly. When I touched what was beside me, I felt another hand. It was ice cold and had unnaturally long fingers. Panic consumed me, and I immediately recoiled. I was paralyzed, the fear pinning me to the bed. Someone's heavy breathing filled the silence of the room. My entire body was on high alert, and the discomfort in my stomach was almost unbearable. Suddenly I heard a woman's voice whispering beside me. At first it was incomprehensible, but soon I recognized it. It was the Lord's Prayer. However, between the verses, there were faint, raspy laughs, as if coming from someone who had smoked for decades. The sound was both subtle and terrifying. I wanted to scream, but it seemed impossible. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. Only the thudding of my heart, loud and erratic, filled the room. I tried to move, but every time I shifted even an inch, the presence beside me drew closer. When I attempted to get up, I felt a hand gripping my arm. The fingers were large and wrapped around my skin firmly. The touch was cold and rough, as if made of something inhuman. Tears filled my eyes and I felt suffocated. The whispering continued, interspersed with mocking laughter. Time seemed frozen, and the seconds dragged on like hours. I could barely breathe, and the presence seemed to move even closer. I felt its cold breath against my face. It carried a heavy smell, and with it came a low, guttural growl. Tears streamed down my face as my mind filled with dread. I couldn't see much beyond the shadow, but I knew it was her. The figure that had been haunting me was there, mere inches away, mocking my helplessness. The icy touch of that figure rested on my face. Its cold, damp fingers slid across my cheeks, sending shivers down my spine that seemed to last forever. Finally, the terrifying moment was broken. I let out a piercing scream that tore through my throat in pain. Within seconds, my mother burst into the room in a panic. The moment the light from the hallway spilled into the room, I felt it let go of me. The room was empty, and I was the only one there. Alarmed, my mother asked, "What happened?" Unable to control myself, I jumped out of bed and ran out of the room. She looked at me confused and scared as I tried to explain, shouting that there had been a woman there. That figure had grabbed my arm and was whispering prayers in my ear. She searched the room and assured me there was no one there. She tried to convince me it was just a nightmare, but it was impossible. Everything had been far too real. I had felt the touch of that hand, heard its laughter and even its breathing. The worst part was when my mother noticed something on my arm. There was a red mark, as if someone had pressed a hot metal against my skin. There was no logical explanation. That night, fear completely overtook me and sleep was out of the question. My parents and I stayed in the living room until dawn, all of us confused and frightened. I took the opportunity to share what I had been thinking. I was certain this figure was connected to Amanda. She had also seen this woman. How was it possible that I was now a target too? We waited anxiously for Rafaela in the morning, but she didn't show up. My mother tried calling her multiple times without success. Meanwhile, she decided to sprinkle holy water throughout the house and even considered calling the priest from the church to bless the place. But nothing could have prepared us for the news that came that afternoon. Amanda had passed away. Rafaela found her in her room. She had passed earlier that morning at the hospital. The news left me utterly shaken. It felt surreal. Rafaela was devastated, and my mother was deeply saddened as well, having had a special fondness for the girl. Although we knew Amanda was ill, no one imagined she would reach the point of ending her suffering. I had always sensed that something was haunting her, something that kept her in constant vigilance, as if she was always being followed. In the days that followed, the house fell into a state of mourning. My parents spent a lot of time comforting Rafaela. I apologized but didn't attend the wake. Places filled with grief and that heavy energy make me uncomfortable. Moreover, I felt it would be inappropriate to ask questions at that time. The answers would have to wait. My mother told me that even Rafaela didn't know exactly what had happened. The most likely explanation was that Amanda couldn't bear the loss of her mother, her greatest companion. Perhaps the emptiness was too great. Even so, something didn't add up. Amanda had always been reserved, but what tormented her seemed to go beyond emotional pain. It was something that remained unexplained. While my parents spent time with Rafaela, I stayed home alone. At first, it made me uneasy, fearing that after that terrifying experience in the early morning, the apparitions would return. But to my surprise, the following days were calm. At times, I thought I saw a shadow out of the corner of my eye or through the windows, but I quickly realized it was just my mind playing tricks on me, probably due to the heightened state of alert I was still in. The truth is that the feeling of being watched had vanished. The heavy atmosphere that had surrounded me seemed to have left, as if it had gone away with Amanda. My mother, concerned, asked me if I was still having nightmares. I said no. She insisted that everything had just been bad dreams, but I knew it was more than that. Even so, I chose to agree with her. It was easier to believe that it had all been a nightmare. To this day, Amanda still occupies my thoughts. Sometimes, I dream of her, not the figure in black, but Amanda herself, walking through the house as if she had never left. The memory of her brings me a mix of sadness and warmth. She was a reserved girl, but in the few conversations we had, I saw how kind she was. I can't understand what haunted her or why it chose her. How did it come to her? Was there something or someone that brought it? I think those answers will never come. I only hope from the bottom of my heart that Amanda is at peace now, wherever she may be. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. My name is Samara, and today I want to tell you about the scariest experience I've ever had. I hope my story serves as a warning, especially for those who rent properties, move houses frequently, or find themselves in similar situations. I discovered that this kind of thing can happen to anyone living in a rental home. I'm originally from Tlalnepantla in the state of Mexico. When I was 26 years old, I was able to leave my parents' house thanks to a job I had landed. I rented an apartment on the third floor of a building, just a few meters from Rio Lerma Avenue back in 2009. The first 2 months were uneventful, but soon I began to notice something unusual. One morning, while brushing my teeth, I noticed blood in the sink. I have sensitive gums, so I thought that might be the reason. But the next day the stains were there again, even though I had cleaned the sink thoroughly the night before. I inspected the entire bathroom, including the ceiling, but found nothing. In fact, I had seen these stains before but had never given them much thought. One night, however, something happened that completely changed my sense of security and robbed me of peace during the night. I woke up to noises coming from the small cabinet behind the bathroom mirror just above the sink. An important detail: I lived alone. I got up, a big mistake, because if it had been an intruder it could have been dangerous. But I didn't think about that at the time. I went to the bathroom. Everything was dark, but the noises continued. I suddenly opened the door and searched for the light switch. At that very moment I felt a slap across my face. The pain was intense, but the shock was even greater. I fell to the floor, and when I got up I realized that despite being alone, the sensation of someone else's presence was real. I turned on the light and looked around. The shower was empty, the bathroom deserted. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a red mark on my cheek, as if a large hand had struck me. An uncontrollable fear took over me. I called a friend who lived about 10 minutes away and begged her to come stay the night with me. When she arrived and saw my face, she was visibly shocked but stayed calm and decided to spend the night with me. With her presence, the house felt more at ease, and we managed to get some sleep. The next morning I woke up with her still beside me. I noticed her eyes were open, but she wasn't moving. Panicking, I shook her, asking what was going on. After a long sigh, she sat up, gasping, and explained that she had just experienced sleep paralysis, something she had never gone through before. She said that during the episode, she heard a man's voice coming from the hallway, calling her name. That's what woke her up. She asked if I had heard anything. I told her no. Then she explained that in that moment when she was immobile but her eyes were open, she heard someone enter and leave the bathroom. The second time the doors made noise, she heard a male voice calling her name. We got up as the sun was already rising. Thinking something might be in the bathroom, we decided to search every corner. The space was small with almost no furniture, so we checked under the sink and in the only cabinet there. We found nothing. Then my friend stepped up onto the toilet lid to look above the mirrored cabinet, the same one where the noises had come from. Suddenly she said, "Samara, is this yours?" She showed me a small emerald green box, which looked like a jewelry case. I took it and replied that no, I had never seen it before. When we opened it, we realized it was an urn. Inside, there was a small bag with ashes and a tag bearing a man's name along with his date of birth and death. I'd rather not repeat the name because just remembering it gives me chills. We dropped the box immediately and left it where it was. I called the landlord and explained what we had found. She apologized profusely and assured me that the name on the tag didn't belong to anyone in her family, but to the father of the family who had rented the apartment before me. He had spent his last years there, gravely ill, and eventually passed away in the apartment. After his death, the family moved to Cuernavaca, apparently leaving the urn behind without the landlord's knowledge. She was shocked, saying she had no idea the ashes were there. Later that afternoon, she came to collect the box. I didn't want to touch it again. I told her about the strange occurrences and how finding the ashes made me think it could be the spirit of that man. The landlord also seemed uneasy but took the urn with her, asking me to let her know if anything else happened so we could figure out what to do. Although I still feel a certain fear and never again felt completely comfortable in the dark, nothing similar happened after that day. Perhaps that presence just wanted us to find the ashes, but I can't understand why it attacked me. Who was he when he was alive? So many questions remain unanswered. Still, I'm grateful I didn't experience anything more terrifying than that. But what about you? If you found something like that in your home, how would you react? After all, it's not every day you come across an urn full of ashes, especially one accompanied by such strange events. I was home alone on a typical winter vacation night. I decided to watch TV in the sunroom, a smaller, cozy space we use for movies and series. This room has a door that leads to the side entrance of the garage. The blinds were closed, and I was under a blanket watching some random movie I can't even remember. Suddenly, the outdoor light turned on, We have a motion sensor light installed outside, and it made me uneasy. I turned the TV volume down, trying to catch any sound, but I knew it was unlikely I'd hear anything from outside. I slightly lifted the blinds to peek out, and at first glance everything seemed normal. There was no way to turn off that annoying light, so I had no choice but to wait for it to go off on its own. I figured maybe some animal had triggered the sensor, a raccoon or a possum perhaps, but the idea didn't quite convince me. To ease my worry, I put on my shoes and went to the side entrance to check. Nobody was there. Relieved, I went back to the couch, trying to relax and resume watching TV. A few minutes passed and the silence was shattered by a loud crash. A bucket full of something had fallen outside. Right after that, the motion sensor triggered the light again. If I had been merely uneasy before, now I was terrified. Something or someone was outside. I hoped it was just an animal, but the fear that it could be something else froze me in place. The couch, strategically positioned as the only blind spot from the side door, felt like my only shield. I couldn't summon the courage to stand up and look directly. Even turning off the TV scared me, as the remote was on the coffee table too far to reach without exposing myself. My eyes stayed fixed on the closed blinds, or rather on what I saw through them. The sharp outline of a human figure was standing on the other side, arms slightly away from their body. I can't describe the chill I felt in my stomach and the way my heart raced. I tried to quietly rise from the couch without drawing attention, but before I could cross the door leading from the sunroom to the dining room, the figure began banging violently on the window. I wanted to do something, yell or scare off whoever it was, but my fear of going outside was stronger. With a trembling voice, I shouted, "I'm calling the police." The banging stopped for a moment, and I noticed the shadow moving toward the door. There stood an elderly woman with a disturbing appearance, her disheveled hair adding to the eerie sight. For a moment my fear subsided, but it quickly came back with full force as she began pounding on the glass door, screaming in a deranged manner. Without thinking twice, I slammed the sunroom door shut and dialed the police. Panicking, I explained that a hysterical elderly woman was trying to break into my house. The person on the other end instructed me to lock myself in a safe room with something to defend myself until the officers arrived. All my worst fears about home invasions came true when I heard the sound of glass shattering outside near the bathroom. I waited a few moments, heart racing, until silence returned. Then, very slowly and silently, I unlocked the bathroom door and opened it just enough to peek. Looking toward the living room, I saw her, the elderly woman with her completely disheveled hair, standing in the center of the room, right in front of a shattered window. As soon as our eyes met, she charged toward the bathroom. Terrified, I screamed like any 17-year-old would and slammed the door shut, locking myself in again. She started pounding on the door relentlessly, murmuring incoherent things I couldn't understand. Inside, I could only cry and quietly beg for her to leave. After what felt like an eternity, I heard knocks on the front door. I quickly opened the small bathroom window and shouted for help. 2 officers approached, guided by my cries. Desperate, I begged them to enter through the broken window at the back of the house. They tried to calm me, assuring me everything would be fine, and soon disappeared toward the back. Shortly after, the pounding on the bathroom door stopped, and I heard a commotion outside. The officers were shouting, ordering the woman to back away. When the situation seemed under control, I cautiously stepped out of the bathroom. The woman was already in custody, unable to resist further. It was clear her mind was in disarray, something reflected in her crazed eyes that briefly met mine before I looked away. Later, we learned that she lived with another woman in a nearby house. This woman, supposedly her caregiver, was never seen by neighbors, and little was known about them. It was discovered that the elderly woman suffered from severe mental health issues and needed specialized care. My parents decided to sue the younger woman, believing it was her responsibility to prevent something so dangerous from happening. However, the lawsuit was lost, which was frustrating. Even so, the elderly woman was removed from the neighborhood and placed in an institution where she could receive the necessary treatment. It was a relief to know the threat was resolved, but the episode left scars that are hard to forget. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to leave a like. It really makes a difference. Okay, let's continue. My name is Matias Herrera, and what I'm about to share happened to my sister Clarice around the year 2000, when we lived in a small village near the port of Veracruz. At that time, our family enjoyed a peaceful life. Clarice was a determined, hard-working woman with a strong personality. She had been married to Ramon for just over 5 years. Together, they built a stable life, a simple yet cozy home, 2 lovely children, and a small family business that provided them with a comfortable living. But as often happens, serenity can be fragile, and something none of us expected soon shook our peace. This upheaval began with Sophia, our neighbor. She was an attractive young woman surrounded by rumors and mysteries. Living alone in the house next door, she was the talk of the village. Some said she had affairs with older men, others claimed she practiced the occult. What no one denied was her magnetic way of captivating and influencing those around her. It all started one August afternoon. Clarice came home in tears, something rare for someone as strong as her. Reluctantly at first, she eventually confided in us after much insistence. She had found a letter hidden in Ramon's pocket. The author, Sophia. In the letter, Sophia declared her love for him and asked him to leave Clarice to be with her. The next day, Clarice confronted Ramon, but he denied everything. He claimed Sophia was just a friendly neighbor and that the letter was nothing more than a meaningless joke. Even so, something changed. He began acting strangely, coming home later and later, avoiding arguments and seeming distant. Clarice was convinced something was going on, but had no proof beyond her intuition. As days went by, the atmosphere at home became suffocating. Ramon's presence became rare, and when he was around, his behavior was erratic. The intimacy between them disappeared. Meanwhile, Sophia seemed to be everywhere, at the market, at church, and often in front of our house, wearing a smile that seemed to taunt Clarice. Then things took a strange turn. One day, while preparing dinner, Clarice heard a noise in the backyard. Investigating, she found a pile of ashes along with a small wax sculpture. The unsettling detail. The figure looked like a replica of Ramon. Terrified, she got rid of the object and cleaned everything up, but the unease lingered. Not long after, Ramon started getting sick. First, there were headaches and unexplained fevers. Then came recurring nightmares, in which he said he was being chased by a shadowy figure. Despite medical consultations, no tests revealed anything abnormal. It was then that my mother, who believed in spiritual forces and rituals, suggested we seek help from a healer. Initially skeptical, Clarice eventually agreed. We sought out Raimundo, a man respected in the village for his wisdom. When he heard our story, his expression grew dark. He said Ramon was likely under the influence of a spell, and all signs pointed to Sophia as the culprit. Raimundo explained that such rituals not only manipulate someone's will, but also physically and emotionally weaken them until they become completely vulnerable. We wasted no time taking action. Raimundo performed a spiritual cleansing of the house and gave Clarice a protective amulet. He also instructed her to sprinkle salt in every corner of the house and burn incense every night to strengthen the home's defenses. For a brief period, Ramon seemed to improve. The nightmares stopped, and his energy began to return. But Sophia wasn't ready to give up. One day, as Clarice returned from the market, Sophia approached her in front of the house. Without hesitation, she declared that Ramon belonged to her, and that nothing Clarice did would change that. Overcome with rage, Clarice tried to attack her, but Sophia merely laughed and said, "He's already been with me. You have no power over him anymore." That night, Ramon's condition worsened. The nightmares returned, even more horrifying than before. He now said he clearly saw Sophia's face in the shadowy figure pursuing him. In his dreams, she whispered incomprehensible words that made him feel trapped. Clarice, feeling helpless, feared she might lose her husband forever. One night, our despair reached its peak. My mother and I were woken by a blood-curdling scream. Rushing to Clarice's room, we found Ramon on the floor, convulsing. His skin was cold, his eyes open but unfocused, as if he were somewhere else. Clarice, in tears, tried to hold him. With no other option, we called Raimundo. He arrived quickly, carrying a bag full of tools and herbs. The ritual that followed is something we'll never forget. Raimundo lit candles and murmured prayers under his breath, sprinkling holy water around the room. Then, he placed a mirror in front of Ramon. What happened next felt like something out of a nightmare. As Raimundo chanted, the mirror fogged up, as though touched by an invisible breath. Then, shadows appeared, moving frantically and forming unidentifiable shapes. Ramon stopped convulsing but broke into tears, repeating Sophia's name over and over. Raimundo managed to calm him and explained that he had blocked part of the spell but couldn't completely break it. He said that to undo what had been done, we'd have to confront the person who had initiated it. That's when we decided it was time to face Sophia, even though we had no idea what that would entail. The next morning, the tension at home was palpable. Ramon remained in bed, his expression one of fear and exhaustion. Whenever we tried to talk about what had happened, he would look away and say only, "I don't want to talk about it." Raimundo, however, gathered us in the living room and warned us that the situation was worse than we imagined. Sophia had crossed every line, and ignoring the problem was no longer an option. This woman isn't acting alone. She's manipulating a force she doesn't fully control. If we don't act soon, the price will be more than we can bear. Raimundo's words filled us with fear but also gave us the courage to act. My mother and Clarice decided to confront Sophia directly. Despite Raimundo's warnings of potential danger, they were determined to face her. When they arrived at Sophia's house, she was already waiting in the front yard, wearing a sarcastic smile and radiating arrogance. Clarice's fury was barely contained. "We know what you're doing. This needs to stop," my sister demanded firmly. Sophia replied with a laugh full of disdain. "Stop? We haven't even reached the best part, darling. Don't worry. Your husband is exactly where he belongs. He thinks of me. He wants to be with me. He was never happy with you." The words cut Clarice like a knife, leaving her on the verge of tears. My mother tried to intervene, appealing to reason, but Sophia remained unmoved. She made it clear she had no intention of giving up and was willing to do whatever it took to keep Ramon under her control. That same night, Raimundo decided to step up his efforts. He prepared a more powerful ritual to protect Ramon and all of us. He asked for an item of Ramon's clothing, holy water, and a black candle. As he prepared everything in the living room, he warned us that the ritual might provoke a violent reaction, both from Sophia and the entity she had summoned. When the ritual began, the atmosphere in the house changed drastically. The air grew dense, almost impossible to breathe. The flame of the black candle flickered wildly, as though under attack by an unseen force. Raimundo started chanting prayers in an unfamiliar language, drawing symbols with holy water around Ramon, who remained in a deep sleep. Suddenly a loud crash shook the house. The windows rattled and a gust of wind extinguished all the candles except the black one. Ramon began writhing on the floor as though something were restraining him. He screamed Sophia's name, begging to be left alone. At that moment, Raimundo raised the mirror he had used earlier and placed it in front of Ramon. What we saw left us frozen. In the mirror's reflection, it wasn't Ramon who appeared. There was a dark figure with glowing eyes and a terrifying smile standing behind him. The room filled with the strong smell of sulfur, and the walls groaned as if they were about to collapse. "Don't look at the mirror, close your eyes," Raimundo shouted. But it was impossible to look away. The figure in the mirror moved its lips, though no sound came out. Finally, Raimundo uttered a final prayer, and with a loud, sharp crack, the mirror shattered into pieces. Ramon stopped screaming and fell into a deep sleep. The smell vanished and the room returned to normal. Even so, Raimundo warned us. This was only a temporary solution. As long as Sophia remains obsessed with Ramon, this will persist. The entity she summoned won't leave easily. We need to find a way to sever the bond between them. The next morning, Ramon woke up confused, with little memory of the previous events. Though he seemed calmer, he remained vulnerable to Sophia's influence. With this in mind, my mother and Clarice decided to seek out a priest to bless our home and provide protection. However, when we arrived at the local church, the priest hesitated. "I've heard stories about Sophia. This situation is more serious than it seems. It's beyond what I can handle. Helping you could bring serious consequences for me." He spoke in a tone that mixed fear and concern. Desperate, they returned home and reported the incident to Raimundo. Understanding the priest's reluctance, he insisted that we couldn't give up. He proposed a bolder plan, breaking into Sophia's house and destroying any object or altar she might be using to keep the spell active. Raimundo instructed us to wait until Sophia left the house. When night fell, we gathered our courage and pressed on. Clarice, my mother, Raimundo, and I. Sophia's house was dark and immersed in an unsettling silence. We entered through the backyard, forcing open the back door. Raimundo guided us straight to the main bedroom. There we found an improvised altar filled with black candles, wax figurines, and photographs of Ramon and other people. At the center was a bowl containing a dark liquid with a nauseating smell, which seemed to be the focal point of it all. Without hesitation, Raimundo began dismantling the altar, extinguishing the candles, breaking the figurines, and reciting prayers in a firm voice. However, before he could finish, a deafening scream echoed through the house. It was Sophia, standing at the door with her face contorted in rage. "You have no right to be here. He is mine. He always has been," she shouted, advancing toward Raimundo. Clarice and my mother tried to hold her back, but Sophia seemed to possess superhuman strength. She managed to push Raimundo, knocking over the mirror he was holding. At that moment, the atmosphere changed drastically. The room was filled with moving shadows, the temperature dropped sharply, and the walls began to tremble. Sophia, however, suddenly froze, as if something invisible had immobilized her. With great effort, Raimundo got up and finished dismantling the altar. The moment he was done, Sophia collapsed to the floor, screaming in pain. We seized the opportunity to flee the house. Outside, Raimundo spoke to us with a serious tone. "We did the right thing, but the price for her will be high." Sophia meddled with forces she didn't understand. Now, she'll have to face the consequences. After the confrontation, the tension in our home subsided and an apparent calm returned. However, it didn't take long for rumors to spread. Sophia was found unconscious in her house and taken to the hospital by neighbors. She remained in a coma for several days, and when she finally woke up, she was completely different. In the village, people said Sophia had lost her sanity. The doctors couldn't explain her condition, but those who knew of her connection to witchcraft believed she had paid a terrible price for meddling with forces beyond her understanding. Sophia was never the same again. She seemed to live under a dark cloud, isolated and detached from the world around her. Meanwhile, in our house, Raimundo appeared restless. Even though he had dismantled Sophia's altar, he knew that interfering with such dark forces came with a high price. "As those who meddle with these things never come out unscathed," he remarked one evening while observing Ramon. My brother-in-law was still frail. He no longer mentioned nightmares or voices, but Raimundo was worried about the effects the ritual might have left on all of us. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Raimundo passed away suddenly in his home. The news hit us like a devastating blow. Although he was elderly, he had always been in robust health. It wasn't easy to dismiss the idea that his death was linked to the ritual. Some believed that the entity he confronted had exacted revenge. Others thought he had exhausted his strength, battling something so powerful. Raimundo's loss left a huge void and made us feel even more vulnerable. Even though he had weakened the bond between Ramon and Sophia, we knew the work wasn't finished. It was then, on a neighbor's recommendation, that we sought the help of a sorcerer named Uriel. His appearance didn't inspire the same confidence as Raimundo, but the urgency of the situation forced us to accept his help. When Uriel arrived, the first thing he did was examine Ramon. "The damage is deep, but it can be repaired," he stated after a long silence. He then asked about the objects Raimundo had used and what had happened during the ritual. In the end, he shook his head with a serious expression. What he did was admirable, but also reckless. By dismantling the altar without properly sealing the bonds, he left a breach that could have affected any of you. These words terrified us. Uriel explained that although the ritual had weakened the connection between Sophia and the entity, it was still present on a deeper level, feeding off the fragments of energy it had collected. To free Ramon completely, we need to close this breach entirely. The ritual Uriel conducted was different from Raimundo's. He told us that family energy was essential and that everyone needed to participate. He set up an improvised altar in the living room with white candles, incense, and a bowl of holy water. He placed Ramon in the center inside a circle of salt and began the prayers while burning aromatic herbs. The tension in the house was palpable. The air felt heavy, and a strange sense of apprehension enveloped us. During the ritual, Ramon began trembling and murmuring incomprehensible words. Uriel instructed us to remain still no matter what happened. At one terrifying moment, Ramon abruptly opened his eyes. His gaze was empty, but his lips moved as if he were conversing with something invisible. Then, he let out a scream that echoed through the house and collapsed to the floor. Uriel didn't stop his prayers, and little by little, the tension in the room began to ease. When he finally concluded, the heaviness in the air lifted, and everything returned to normal. Ramon woke up, exhausted but with an expression we hadn't seen in weeks. "I feel like it's gone," he said in a weak voice. Uriel confirmed that the ritual had worked, but warned us that Ramon's recovery would be slow and gradual. He also recommended performing periodic spiritual cleansings to prevent any chance of relapse. Over time, Ramon began to recover. It took months for him to regain his energy and emotional balance, but he eventually overcame the traumas of that experience. He resumed his work and family life, though he carried a deep sense of guilt for putting everyone in danger due to an impulsive decision. Ramon passed away in 2020 from complications caused by COVID-19. As for Sophia, her life never returned to normal. She remained isolated, and according to the few who saw her, she had completely lost her sanity. Eventually, she left the village, and we never heard from her again. This experience left a deep and indelible mark on our family. We learned that there are forces one should never tamper with, and that love, when twisted by obsession, can become destructive in unimaginable ways. To this day, we carry immense gratitude for Raimundo, whose sacrifice and courage helped us escape such a dark period in our lives. Reinaldo and I share an apartment and met through work. We live about 15 minutes from the office and carpool daily. I'll get straight to the point. Recently, a new neighbor moved into the house next door, just 2 weeks ago. We didn't see anyone moving in, nor did we ever catch a glimpse of their face. We didn't even know if it was a man, a woman, or how many people had moved in. Later, we deduced it was a man. On the third day, we decided to go over to introduce ourselves. However, when we knocked on the door, no one answered. His car was in the driveway, so we assumed he was home, but for some reason, he didn't want to answer. As we were heading back, Reinaldo called my attention, whispering for me to look at the window next to the door. I looked up and noticed someone slightly lifting the blinds, peeking out at us. I exchanged an uncomfortable glance with Reinaldo, and we went on our way, concluding that the situation was, at the very least, strange. From that moment on, it was clear to us that living next to this neighbor would not be easy. That same night, around 1 in the morning, I was awakened by noises coming from outside. Since it's a warm region and we keep the windows open, the sound was clear. My room, upstairs, overlooks the neighbor's backyard, which was exactly where the noise was coming from. There he was, a bulky man wearing a hoodie, unusual, considering it was about 72 degrees Fahrenheit. He was vigorously sawing a large piece of wood. The scene was surreal. I knocked on Reinaldo's bedroom door, as he had also been woken up by the noise. He had to work early the next day, and the whole situation seemed utterly unreasonable. The sawing went on for quite a while until we decided to politely ask him to stop. We went to the backyard gate instead of knocking on the front door. As soon as we knocked, the sawing stopped. We waited for him to come out, but he never did. At least the noise was over, so we went back to bed. A few days later, we were woken up in the middle of the night by new noises, but this time it was screaming. At first, it took me a while to understand what it was, but when I looked out the window, I realized it was coming from inside the neighbor's house. I saw the man in the backyard again, this time running into the house while dragging something I couldn't identify. He stopped and looked directly at my window, retreating when he noticed I was watching him. I immediately ran to Reinaldo's room. He was already up, also awakened by the screams. Without hesitation, he called the police to report what was happening. While he was on the phone, I stood near the door. Suddenly, we heard a loud noise coming from downstairs. The back door had been opened. Reynaldo yelled into the phone, urging the dispatcher to send help immediately, informing her that the man had broken into our house. He stayed on the line as we tried to listen for footsteps coming up the stairs. The footsteps were clear, echoing from downstairs. Back in Reynaldo's room, we carefully shut the door. He asked the dispatcher to inform the officers to enter through the back as soon as they arrived, then hung up. Since there was no lock on the door, we leaned our weight against it, ready to prevent any attempt to break in. The footsteps on the stairs grew quicker. We heard the bathroom door open and then close again. After that, the footsteps headed straight toward Reynaldo's bedroom door. The man started forcing his way in, using his shoulder and banging with something heavy. That's exactly why we didn't try to confront him directly. We had no idea what kind of weapon he might be carrying. Despite his efforts, he couldn't break down the door. After several failed attempts, we heard the footsteps retreating downstairs, followed by an eerie silence. We waited a few minutes before opening the door to peek out. There was no one in the hallway. Suddenly, a shout echoed from downstairs in a firm voice. "Police!" Relieved, we ran down the stairs, but when we got there, we didn't see any officers. However, I noticed someone crouched behind our dining table. I shouted for Reynaldo to run back upstairs with me. Before we reached the stairs, the person behind the table stood up and started chasing us. This time, we locked ourselves in the bathroom, where at least the door had a lock. We didn't stay there for long because we heard the same voice downstairs again. "Police!" This time it sounded genuine. The man trying to break into the bathroom suddenly stopped, and silence fell over the upstairs. We yelled at the top of our lungs, "We're up here, up here!" Soon 2 officers came upstairs, ordering the man to drop his weapon. The next sound we heard was a knife clattering to the floor. When the officers told us to come out, we opened the door. They had the man in handcuffs and were taking him to the patrol car. Reynaldo and I explained that we had heard screams coming from the house next door and asked them to check it out. Armed, the officers entered the neighbor's house. Shortly after, another patrol car arrived on our street, followed by 2 more. We were horrified to see the officers coming out of the man's house with a woman crying uncontrollably. We learned she had been locked in the basement, screaming for help. We also saw that there was a body in a bag, the same one the man had dragged through the backyard. We never learned all the details of that night, who the woman was or whose body it was, but we have no doubt that man will spend the rest of his life in prison. His house is now up for rent, and all we hope is that this time someone ordinary and peaceful moves in. My name is Henrique. In 2016, financial difficulties forced me to leave the apartment where I lived and look for a more affordable rental. I ended up finding a simple little house in a nearby neighborhood. It was modest, practically empty, but sufficient for my needs and within my budget. There were no apparent major issues, and I assumed the low price was due to the lack of furniture. I brought the basics I had and moved in. 2 weeks later, I arranged a small gathering with friends to celebrate. We had a pleasant evening, chatting after dinner, making do with the seating available between the living room and the dining area. Suddenly, all of us, in unison, turned toward a built-in wardrobe in the hallway leading to the bedroom just past the bathroom. The reason? 2 loud knocks came from inside it. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of something desperately scratching at the wood. I couldn't quite figure out what it was. It sounded like a dog trying to get out, but at the same time, it was unsettling, as if it wasn't an ordinary animal. One of my friends stood up, and I followed him while the others tried to rationalize the noise. Perhaps rats, a trapped cat, or something similar. When we were halfway down the hallway near the kitchen and just a few steps from the wardrobe, we all clearly heard the laughter of a woman coming from inside it. Our reaction was immediate. We ran outside, leaving all the lights on. It wasn't too late, probably around 7 in the evening, but the sky was already dark. One of my friends suggested I call the landlord to explain what had happened. Maybe someone was hiding in there. I made the call. The man who answered sounded about 50 years old. I put the call on speaker so everyone could hear. I described what had occurred while we all kept our eyes fixed on the hallway, now visible from outside the house. He listened silently, asked for a moment, but forgot to cover the microphone completely. We could hear him speaking to his wife. She's back in that house again, and she replied, puzzled. "What? But wasn't she the one who died 2 months ago? Yes, but she's still there. I exchanged glances with my friends. No one knew what to say. It didn't seem like a joke, especially since it involved something serious like a rental agreement. The man got back on the phone and, in a more serious tone, asked if I had a place to stay for the night. He assured me nothing would happen to my belongings and said he understood what was happening. He promised we would meet at the house the next day to discuss everything, and he would arrange for me to move to another, newer and furnished house in the same neighborhood at the same price as compensation. Then one of my friends, still on speakerphone, decided to ask what had happened in that house. Reluctantly, the landlord began to explain. The previous tenants reported that a woman would appear at night, knocking on the front door and terrifying everyone. They described her appearance and even showed me a photo. In it, the woman looked frightening, with completely disheveled hair peering through a window. They never saw her actually entering, but it was evident she was there. Later, her body was found in the neighborhood. It was confirmed to be the same woman from the photo. No one knows who she was or how she died. A couple rented the house after them, but they didn't last 24 hours inside. They called me in desperation, saying the same woman appeared inside the house, coming out of the wardrobe during the day and night. She would pull the woman's hair and then run back to the wardrobe, closing the door behind her. In the end, they quickly packed up and left, as they recognized her as the woman from the photo. The landlord told us he had no doubts it was her. He apologized again and insisted I not spend the night in the house. He assured me that the following morning he would help me move to another place. It was, without a doubt, the most surreal experience I've ever had. Neither I nor my friends could process it. I took his advice, spent the night elsewhere, and the next day, with the landlord's and my friends' help, I moved to a new home. I continued living in that neighborhood for many years, but that house remained empty and forgotten, eventually turning into an abandoned place. I never had the courage to bring up the subject with the landlord again, afraid of sounding disrespectful. I imagine the house is still the same, with no one daring to live there. And what about you? Have you ever been offered a house or apartment at a price that seemed too good to be true, only to discover something strange that justified the cost? Share your story in the comments. During a certain period, I lived in a small apartment in a town's interior, just a few steps away from the central square. It was a modest building where the ground floor housed a beauty salon. Nobody lived on the ground floor. It was used solely for commercial purposes. On the second floor, there were 2 apartments, mine and a neighbor's. The absence of residents on the ground floor at night played an important role in this story, as you will soon understand. After 3 months living there, a man moved into the apartment next door. I was 25 years old and he seemed a bit older. Our conversations were brief and sporadic since we rarely crossed paths. But shortly after his arrival, something disturbing began to happen. In the middle of the night, I would wake up to the sound of a baby crying. It was such a loud cry that it penetrated the thick walls of the building. My sleep became chaotic, disrupted night after night until I had been in the apartment for 4 months. I avoided talking to him about the crying. After all, how could I bring up such a delicate topic? Moreover, I never saw any children entering or leaving his apartment, nor any signs that he had company, like a wife or girlfriend. So how could that sound be coming from his side? One afternoon, he showed up at my door, visibly embarrassed. "Hi neighbor, sorry to bother you, but I need to say something. Sometimes I end up late for work because your baby's crying keeps me up at night. If you need help with him, feel free to count on me. I'm a nurse." Surprised, I replied, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I hear that crying too, but it seems to come from your side." He looked just as confused as I was. He confirmed that he didn't have any children. We were both puzzled. How could we hear something so close if neither of us had kids? Besides, the sound didn't seem to come from anywhere else nearby. Before heading to work, he promised to return later with a friend who, according to him, might be able to help in some way. Meanwhile, I decided to leave too, as the idea of staying alone in the apartment was starting to unsettle me. When I came back that night, I hesitated to enter. My neighbor appeared and handed me candles and a small bottle of oil. He explained that his friend had suggested some sort of ritual. lighting the candles in the spots where the crying was the loudest and leaving the oil nearby. I thanked him and followed his instructions exactly. That night the crying was louder than ever. It seemed as if someone was carrying the baby around my neighbor's apartment. To distract myself, I turned the TV up and tried to sleep. Despite the constant interruptions, I eventually managed to rest. After that night, the sound disappeared. The next day, I ran into my neighbor who said his night had also been heavy, but it seemed the ritual had worked. Thanks to it, we were finally able to find peace again. We became closer after that, and even though I eventually moved out of that building, we remain friends to this day. If that sound really came from the spirit of a child, I can only hope it has finally found rest, because without a doubt, it robbed us of many nights of sleep. A lot of people say that when we hear babies crying in situations like this, it might not actually be a child, perhaps something entirely different. But what if it truly is a baby trying to express itself with the only tool it has, crying? What's your opinion on this? Good evening, Dom. My name is Cicero. I was born and raised in a humble neighborhood in Guanajuato, a city in Mexico, in a small apartment where I lived with my mother. My father left our lives when I was just 6 years old. Despite this, my mother never allowed emptiness or sadness to take over our home. The place was modest, but she always made sure to make it cozy. She would pick flowers from the market to decorate the rooms and used a lavender-scented cleaner that filled the entire space. That scent, to me, was like a charm, an invisible barrier against any negativity. My room was my sanctuary. Small and simple, it was where I would draw and write in my notebook, letting everything in my mind flow. It was my little corner, my escape, the place where I could truly be myself. My mother always said I had a unique way of seeing the world and encouraged me to dream and create fearlessly. Her eyes overflowed with confidence in me, and that alone was enough to make me believe in who I was. I never imagined anything could shake the bond that united us. Everything began to change when she told me she was seeing someone. With sparkling eyes, she spoke of Marcos, a kind and hard-working man, someone who, according to her, would bring us security and happiness. Although I felt a strange unease, I told her that if she was happy, I would be too. When Marcos visited us for the first time, he seemed like a pleasant and friendly man. Tall and soft-spoken, he brought me a notebook for drawing. "Your mother told me you have incredible talent," he said, handing me the gift with a smile. My mother looked radiant, so I swallowed any discomfort and simply thanked him. Marcos had a son named Edgar, a teenager slightly older than me, full of energy and enthusiasm. While I spent hours in my room sketching and writing, he explored every corner of the apartment as if he already belonged there. His energy was intense, almost suffocating, and his scrutinizing looks made me uneasy. At first, he barely spoke to me, but it was impossible to ignore the way he seemed to assess my every move. Marcos, on the other hand, was helpful. He fixed things that had been broken for a long time and seemed eager to show he could be a good partner for my mother. Still, there was something about him that made me suspicious, as if every act of kindness had a hidden purpose. Meanwhile, Edgar took up space so naturally that it was irritating, acting as though he didn't need permission for anything. One day, while I was drawing in the living room, Edgar appeared behind me. He looked at my notebook for a few seconds before saying, "Don't you have anything more useful to do?" He laughed and walked away, leaving a heavy atmosphere in the room. My mother, who was in the kitchen, noticed nothing. It was as if she were oblivious to these small tensions. Over time, the peace that once filled our home began to fade. Quiet nights were replaced by the sounds of Edgar lifting improvised weights and his loud laughter echoing through the rooms. Marcos gradually started making comments about the time I spent drawing, suggesting I should do something more useful. My mother, increasingly focused on pleasing him, seemed to drift away from me, ignoring what I felt and said. One afternoon, I came home from school to find my sketchbook tossed carelessly on the living room table. The pages were bent, and some were defaced with harsh words scrawled in bold letters. Useless. Ridiculous. It didn't take much to figure out it was Edgar's doing. When I confronted him, he just shrugged. "Relax, it's just a joke." Marcos, sitting nearby, decided to add something. Maybe you need to learn not to get so attached to things. It's part of growing up. Although his tone was calm, his words cut deep. With each passing day, I felt more and more out of place at home. My mother still tried to take care of me, leaving my favorite meal in my room or folding my clothes with extra care, but it was clear it wasn't enough to fill the growing void. The lavender scent that once comforted me had disappeared, replaced by a heavy, stifling atmosphere. One night, as I tried to fall asleep, I heard voices coming from Marcos and my mother's bedroom. He was speaking loudly, clearly angry, while her voice barely rose above a whisper. I caught one phrase from him. "I do everything for this family, and you should be grateful for it." The next morning, my mother pretended nothing had happened, but something was different about her, an exhausted look mixed with what seemed to be pure fear. I retreated further into my drawings, but even this escape was losing its power. One afternoon, while cleaning the living room, I found an envelope hidden among the towels. Inside was a letter written by my mother. The words froze me. "If anything happens to me, take care of Cicero. He means everything to me. Forgive me, son." I put the letter back where I found it and never mentioned that I had seen it. My mother was still the same caring person I had always known, but it was clear that something was eating away at her. I knew I had to do something even at 14 years old, though I had no idea how to act. The atmosphere at home grew increasingly unbearable. The arguments between Marcos and my mother became more frequent, even though she tried to hide them from me. It was a cycle of tension that seemed endless. One of those difficult days, I noticed the presence of Leonel, an elderly neighbor who lived at the end of the street. He had always caught my attention for being a peculiar figure. He lived in a small house, but his garden was full of intriguing decorations, gargoyles and religious images worn by time. He would usually sit in his rocking chair, reading books with dark covers. On an especially bad day, after another argument at home, I went out to walk and clear my mind. Before I knew it, I was standing in front of Leonel's gate. He, sitting as always in his chair, was watching me. Without preamble, he said, "Your eyes carry a weight they shouldn't at your age." His voice was calm but firm, as if he could see straight through me. Before I could reply, he invited me in. For the first time in a long while, someone seemed genuinely interested in how I was feeling. His house was like another universe. The walls were lined with shelves full of old books and objects I had never seen before, candles in unusual shapes, dark-colored crystals, and a globe that seemed to contain a black liquid. Every detail felt like it had come out of a strange dream. I sat in silence, listening as he said, "People are always looking for ways to escape what haunts them. Some succeed, but never without paying a price." I didn't fully understand what Leonel meant, but his words echoed within me. Over time, I began visiting him regularly, especially on days when everything at home seemed to be falling apart. He never asked me direct questions, but he had an uncanny ability to say exactly what I needed to hear. He told stories of people who faced unimaginable difficulties and somehow found a way forward. But he always added, "Choices have consequences you may not be ready to face." Meanwhile, my life at home only got worse. Edgar became even more invasive and cruel, entering my room without permission, messing with my things, and making cruel jokes about my drawings. Marcos, instead of stepping in, just dismissed it. "It's just sibling stuff," he would say. But Edgar wasn't my sibling, and Marcos was definitely never my father. One night, after Edgar destroyed several of my pages and Marcos once again defended him, something inside me snapped. I locked myself in my room, trying to process the mix of anger and despair. It was unbearable, but I didn't know how to change the situation. Then I remembered Leonel's words. There are ways to change everything, but every choice comes with a price. The next day I returned to Leonel's house. He opened the door before I could knock, as if he already knew I was coming. "You're back," he said with a faint smile, gesturing for me to come in. This time the house felt darker and a strong scent of incense hung in the air. I sat down and poured everything out. How I felt, how it seemed there was no way out of my situation. Leonel listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally until he finally spoke. "There are ways to change this, but you must be sure, once it's done, there's no going back." He pulled a large leather-bound book from a shelf and placed it in front of me. This book contains what you're looking for, but don't be mistaken. The forces it invokes are not kind. There is always a cost. I carefully opened the book. The pages were aged and filled with symbols I had never seen before. Some images seemed to move under the dim light. It's a ritual, Lionel explained, to summon something greater than yourself. But you must be clear in your request and accept the price that will be demanded. He detailed what I would need: personal objects from those involved, a space where I could be alone, and the determination to follow the process without interruption, with absolute focus. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. I nodded, even though fear was growing inside me. That night I waited until everyone at home was asleep. I took one of Edgar's shirts, a watch Marcos always left in the living room, and a photo of me and my mother taken years ago and kept in a drawer. Choosing to include my mother was painful, but something in me believed she was also responsible for what was happening. In the backyard, under the moonlight, I began to follow the instructions. I drew the symbols from the book on the ground with a white stone, placed the objects in the center, and recited the words I had memorized. The air grew heavy, the cold consumed me, and the darkness seemed to expand around me. First came the whispers, then a deep voice that resonated inside my mind. "You called me, and here I am. What do you want?" My entire body trembled, but I summoned all the courage I could find and replied, "I want them all to disappear." The voice, calm and firm, responded, "So it shall be, but remember, every debt must be paid." Without warning, the atmosphere returned to normal, but something had undeniably changed. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I had a troubling certainty. What I had done had irreversibly altered my life. The next morning, the house felt off. There was something unusual, as if an invisible thread had unraveled our routine. The air, colder than usual, and the silence, though not complete, carried a suffocating tension. My mother seemed unaware of the oddity, at least at first, but I felt that something was unfolding in the shadows. Marcos was the first to show that something was out of place. That afternoon, while training with Edgar in the backyard, a loud crash echoed. I rushed out and found him on the ground, gasping and clutching his chest. He explained that he had tripped over some weights while trying to lift more than he could handle. It was the first time I'd seen him like that, so vulnerable. "It must have been just a silly accident," my mother said, helping him inside. But from that day on, Marcos began to deteriorate. The cough became a constant companion, and his movements lost their usual steadiness. Despite my mother's insistence that he see a doctor, Marcos refused. "I don't need anyone telling me what I already know. It's nothing." Edgar, on the other hand, grew impatient and aggressive. He spent hours obsessively training with a focus that defied logic. One night, I was awakened by screams coming from the backyard. When I went outside, I saw Edgar on his knees, his face buried in his hands. "I can't take this anymore," he whispered. As soon as he noticed me, he quickly got up and locked himself in his room without saying another word. The tension in the house only grew. Marcos and Edgar barely spoke, while my mother seemed weighed down by it all. Then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while everyone was going about their routine, the police knocked on our door. They brought the news. Edgar had been found unconscious in a warehouse where he trained. He had tried to lift more weight than he could handle and suffered a fatal accident. My mother was devastated by the loss. Marcos masked his pain with anger, but my mother's grief was evident. At night, her muffled sobs echoed through the house. Yet there was something in her eyes beyond sadness, something that suggested fear, as if she knew this was no mere coincidence. Marcos, for his part, soon followed a similar path. His health deteriorated rapidly, his appetite vanished, and he seemed to shrink day by day. One night I heard him shouting from his room during an argument with my mother, "This house is cursed." It was the last time I heard his voice so full of life. The next morning, Marcos was found lifeless in his bed. My mother tried to remain strong, but soon she too began to fall ill. First came mild aches, then persistent fever and an exhaustion that left her bedridden. I did everything I could to care for her, but it never felt like enough. One night, as I brought her a glass of water, she grabbed my hand with surprising strength for her condition. In a faint voice, she said, "Forgive me, Cicero." That was the last sound I heard from my mother. After her death, The house was engulfed in an unbearable silence. Every room seemed saturated with painful memories, as if the walls had absorbed the fear and anguish. Walking through the halls felt like wandering through a mausoleum. What was once a home now felt like a grim reminder of all I had lost. Despite my efforts to move on, the guilt would not leave me in peace. I knew my actions had not only taken Marcos and Edgar's lives, but also destroyed my mother. I kept the items I used in the ritual: Marcos's watch, Edgar's shirt, and a photo of my mother. They were more than just objects. They were reminders of the burden my choices had brought. Then, one day, an unexpected letter arrived, changing everything. The plain envelope contained a message carefully written by a woman claiming to be the mother of Marcos's son, a boy named Raul, who was 14 years old. In the letter, she explained that Raul had been struggling since his father's death and asked for my help. "I know this isn't your fault, but he has no one else. Anything you can do will be enough." My first reaction was to ignore it. How could I help someone so closely tied to Marcos after everything that had happened? But as the days went by, Raul's image lingered in my mind. I decided to seek him out. When I finally met him, I was surprised. He was thin, with a tired and melancholic expression. There was something in his eyes that mirrored a part of me, the weight of bearing more than he should at his age. "Are you related to my dad?" he asked, wary. I nodded, unable to form an explanation. In that moment, I realized Raul was blameless. He was just another victim of the circumstances. Helping Raul was a challenge. At first, the guilt consumed me every time I looked at him, as his features reminded me of everything that had happened. Yet something inside me urged me to keep going. Perhaps it was my way of seeking redemption, of trying to make up, at least in part, for the damage I had caused. At the beginning, my help was practical. I contributed financially with the basics, but it soon became clear that Raul needed more than that. His empty gaze and his silence spoke what he couldn't put into words. I decided to be more present, even if it meant confronting the ghosts that haunted me every time I saw him. Raul lived with his mother, a kind woman worn down by hardship. She accepted my help with gratitude, but maintained a respectful distance, never questioning my motivations. I was thankful for that. Every time I left their house, it felt like I was leaving behind a small piece of my own burden, though I knew it would never completely disappear. Over time, Raul began to open up, albeit cautiously. He wasn't much of a talker, but his actions showed he was starting to trust me. He accepted my invitations for walks and occasionally shared small details about his life. He told me how Marcos had been absent for most of his childhood, yet he still held on to the hope of one day having a real relationship with his father. That hope died with Marcos, leaving Raul trapped between sadness and uncertainty. Every time Raul mentioned Marcos, a heavy feeling settled in my chest. He didn't know the truth about what had happened, and I had no intention of telling him. To Raul, Marcos was a flawed father, but still his father. There was no reason to tarnish that memory with the dark secrets I carried. Months passed, and Raul began showing signs of transformation. Slowly, he regained his energy and rediscovered dreams he had abandoned. His mother confided in me that he had started reading again, a habit he had given up after his father's death. Seeing his recovery brought me a bittersweet joy. I was happy for him, but the memory of my past reminded me that the scars on my soul would never truly fade. As Raul moved forward, I continued to wrestle with the remnants of the darkness that lingered over my life. The house where it all happened had been demolished shortly after I moved out, but the weight of my actions remained. Some nights I woke with the unsettling feeling of a presence in the room. There was never anything there, but it felt as if the ritual had left an invisible scar, impossible to erase. One quiet afternoon, while we were walking in the park, Raul asked a question that caught me off guard. "Why do you do this for me?" He didn't sound suspicious, just curious. I hesitated before answering and finally said, "Sometimes helping someone else is the only way to help yourself." Raul didn't press further, but the look he gave me made it clear he understood more than he let on. As time went on, he found new purpose. He began excelling in school and developed an interest in engineering, a path he had never considered before. When he shared his new ambition with me, I saw something rare in his eyes: hope. Knowing I had helped him find that gave me a sense that my life still had some value, even if only because I had helped him discover his. Still, the shadows didn't completely disappear. One night I had a disturbing dream that left me shaken. I was back in the backyard of the old house, surrounded by a darkness so dense I could barely see. Then I heard the voice from the ritual again: "The debt has not yet been paid." I woke up gasping for air, gripped by an intense cold. I looked around, but everything was still. However, the calm was deceptive. As time passed, the signs began to reappear: movements in the corners of my eyes, unintelligible whispers, and the constant feeling of being watched. I tried to focus on Raoul and his journey, but I couldn't ignore the fact that something was still out of place. One day, while helping Raoul with a school project, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was familiar. It was Lionel. "I thought it was time we had a talk," he said, his tone enigmatic. He suggested we meet at a cafe on the other side of the city, a place I had never been to. That night I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with thoughts about what Lionel could possibly want after all this time. Since the ritual, he had disappeared, and I never expected to hear from him again. Something about his tone made it clear this meeting was no coincidence. I knew I couldn't ignore it, but I was deeply afraid of what might come to light. The cafe was in a forgotten part of the city, a place that seemed to exist on the fringes of the world. When I walked in, I saw Lionel sitting in the back, surrounded by shadows that seemed to cling to him. The years hadn't left any visible marks on him. His hair was still immaculate, his gaze piercing, and his unsettling calm intact. I sat across from him, speechless. He was the first to break the silence. "I knew you'd come eventually," he said, slowly stirring his coffee. His confident tone unnerved me. Before I could respond, he continued, "How have you been dealing with the shadows, Cicero?" The question hit me like an unexpected blow. It felt as though he had been watching me from afar all this time. I tried to keep my composure and told him how my life had changed after the ritual, but that I still bore the weight of it all. Lying felt pointless. Lionel always seemed to see through words. "Consequences never truly disappear," he said, leaning closer. "What you did didn't just affect those in that house. You disrupted something much larger, a balance that should never have been touched. Did you think you could ask for something without paying the full price? The debt is still outstanding." And a chill ran through me. All this time I had believed the price had already been paid, the deaths of Marcos, Edgar, and my mother, along with the guilt that consumed me daily. But according to him, it wasn't enough. "The ritual doesn't just affect others, it leaves a mark on you, Cicero. Your soul carries that scar, and it doesn't fade easily." I tried to justify myself. I told him about Raoul, about how I was trying to make amends by helping him rebuild his life. But Lionel merely shook his head, dismissing my words. "Redemption doesn't come from what you do afterward. It lies in what you summon when you cross the line." He continued, explaining that the ritual not only removed Marcos and Edgar from my life, but also opened a door I had no control over to close. The shadows, the whispers, they weren't figments of my imagination, but remnants of what I had awakened. And as long as that door remained open, I would never be free. It was then that I realized the depth of my mistake. The decision I made years ago not only destroyed lives, but left a void that could never be filled. Lionel, however, wasn't finished. He pulled a small leather-bound book from his bag and placed it on the table between us. "Here lies the truth you need," he said firmly. "If you want to close that door, you'll have to face what you summoned. But I warn you, the price will be even greater." I took the book with trembling hands. It was smaller than the previous one, but as I opened it, I felt something unsettling. The words seemed to vibrate, shifting before my eyes. The symbols were familiar, but now they appeared even more menacing. Lionel stared at me, his expression impossible to decipher. "Think carefully before you act," he said, standing up slowly. "There's no turning back, Cicero, and this time the consequences may be far worse." He left without waiting for a response, leaving me with the book and a flood of thoughts. That night I returned home with the book hidden under my coat. I placed it on the kitchen table and spent hours staring at it, unable to muster the courage to open it again. Leonel's words echoed in my mind. Was I prepared to pay an even greater price? What would it mean, after all, to face what I had unleashed? The following days were consumed by uncertainty. Raoul carried on with his life, oblivious to the turmoil in my head. Seeing his smile brought me fleeting moments of peace, but it also reminded me that any decision I made now could affect him deeply. I couldn't risk anything that might endanger his life. That night I decided I could no longer bear the burden. I opened the book and began to read. The instructions resembled those of the first ritual, but there was something more intimate and sinister this time. It wasn't about banishing someone, but confronting the entity that had responded to my call and negotiating my freedom. The ritual required a mirror, a black candle, and symbols of my past. I took Marcos's watch, Edgar's shirt, and my mother's photograph. The same objects from the first ritual now carried an almost unbearable weight. I prepared everything in silence, drawing the circle on the floor. When everything was ready, I lit the candle, placed the objects in the center, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The words in the book were difficult, but I spoke them with as much clarity as I could muster. As soon as I finished, I felt a shift in the air. The cold engulfed the room, and darkness seemed to creep into every corner. Then that voice returned as deep as the first time. "You're back. What do you want now?" My body trembled, but there was no room for hesitation. "I want to close the door." The response came swiftly, firm and unforgiving. "That comes with a price, and it won't be small." The air grew heavier, and the cold seemed to pierce my soul. I knew the price would be high, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead terrified me. The voice continued. "I gave you what you asked for. I removed them all from your life, but in doing so, you brought me into yours. That door you opened is not just a passage, it's a bond. To seal it, you must offer what you value most." I thought of Raoul, how he had become my sole source of hope. I remembered my mother, Marcos, and Edgar, and everything I had already lost. Now, this entity was demanding more. My heart rebelled against the idea, but I knew running away was no longer an option. I made a decision that felt inevitable. I closed my eyes, and with a voice steady despite the fear, responded, "Take me instead." The room seemed to tremble, and the voice, tinged with both approval and mockery, replied, "A bold decision. But this is no ordinary exchange. Your sacrifice must be absolute, not just your body, but your presence in this world will be erased. Every trace of your existence will be forgotten. Do you accept?" My hands trembled, but I nodded. The entity didn't hesitate. A biting cold surged through my body, and I felt as if a part of me was being violently torn away. The darkness around me grew thicker, consuming everything. Before everything vanished, I thought of Raoul. His smile, his strength, the life full of possibilities still ahead of him. If my absence ensured his freedom, then the price was worth it. When I opened my eyes, everything had changed. The house was empty, devoid of any signs of the ritual. The symbols on the floor were gone, and the candle was nothing more than melted wax. I stepped outside, and the air felt different, lighter, as if years of oppression had finally lifted. In the days that followed, I noticed that people who once knew me no longer recognized me. It was as if my existence had been erased. I tried to approach Raoul, but seeing him from a distance, I realized he was fine. He talked and laughed with his mother, accompanied by a man who seemed to have taken on a fatherly role in his life. I walked away, choosing not to interfere. My sacrifice had worked. Over time, I came to understand the magnitude of what I had done. My bond with the entity was broken, and Raoul was free to live without the shadows of my past. Though my existence had been erased, I found solace in knowing he was safe. Now I was just an observer, wandering the streets unnoticed, witnessing life go on without me. Despite the loneliness, I had no regrets. I did what needed to be done, and though the shadows never returned, on the quietest nights, I sometimes felt a presence beside me. It didn't seem threatening, but neither was it friendly. It was a constant reminder that while the door was closed, the price of my choices would stay with me. My story ends here. There is no full redemption, nor a happy ending. There is only the certainty that some decisions, no matter how painful, are inevitable. And so, I wander the world, at peace with the fact that my sacrifice ensured others freedom from the shadows I had unleashed. In the first week after moving to Tacubaya in Mexico City, I rented a small ground-floor apartment on Avenida José Martí. The low price, considering the location, made me think it was because of its small size. Other than that, everything seemed normal. While organizing my belongings, just a few still packed in boxes, I decided to stack some decorations in a built-in closet. By accident, I dropped a small toolbox on the floor. The impact caused one of the wooden floorboards to lift, startling me. At first, I thought I'd have to pay for the repair. But as I bent down to pick up the box, I noticed the board wasn't just loose. It was hiding a hollow space underneath. Curious, I moved a few more boards, which were practically loose, and uncovered something unexpected. There was a small staircase leading downward. I cautiously descended. Below the apartment, I found an unfinished room with bare concrete walls and a ceiling so low I had to crouch. The space was about 5 by 4 meters, maybe a basement. At first I thought it was something abandoned, but then I noticed electrical wiring attached along the seam where the walls met the ceiling. These cables ran up toward my apartment and also through a wall that had recently been sealed with concrete. I followed the wires to a small hole in that wall, and as I got closer I heard voices on the other side. I felt a chill run down my spine. I rushed back up the stairs. I decided to trace the path of the cables in the apartment, but they disappeared into the walls. They didn't seem like regular wiring, but rather cables for a closed-circuit surveillance system. Since I work in that field, I recognized the setup immediately. What was strange was that no one had mentioned the existence of cameras in the building. I didn't see any in the 2 floors or the 2 apartments in the property. And the worst part, that basement had direct access to my apartment. That realization alarmed me, and I was paying rent weekly, so I packed my things and left that same day. I didn't want to find out what those cameras were monitoring or who else might have access to that strange space. I left everything as it was, including the loose floorboards. The landlord never tried to contact me. On the contrary, he blocked me. Months later, I passed by the avenue and saw the building cordoned off with yellow tape. It stayed like that for a while before it was converted into a store. Apparently, the property was sold or repurposed. To this day, I prefer not to think about what might have happened if I had stayed there. Maybe I escaped something far more dangerous than I ever imagined. And you, have you ever had a frightening experience while renting a property? What do you usually check before choosing a house or apartment? What do you think is important to avoid situations caused by malicious people or perhaps something supernatural? I own a small house situated on a large plot of land in rural New York State. During the winter, I usually spend some time there to enjoy skiing. Although I have a nearby neighbor, we've never exchanged a word. A fence separates our properties. On the other side of the house, there's a vast forest that seems to stretch endlessly. Further down the same road lives another neighbor with whom I've spoken a few times. We share a love for skiing. That's how we met. This past January, I made my first visit to the house for the season. As I approached the front door, I heard the sound of a child laughing coming from the direction of my neighbor's house. It caught my attention because I didn't know they had children. Entering that house after so long is always a peculiar process. I had to take care of the usual chores, turning on the heat, the water, and ensuring everything was in order. After the long 4-hour drive from Connecticut, I slept deeply on the first night. The next morning, after a hearty breakfast, I got ready to go skiing. As I stepped outside, I noticed something unusual, a large red ball resting on the snow in my front yard. I hadn't seen it the day before, so I assumed it belonged to the neighbors. I picked it up and tossed it back over the fence. Then I headed to the ski station, where I spent the day with friends. When I returned that evening, I was exhausted. However, as I walked to the door, I noticed the red ball was back in the same spot on my lawn. I found it odd, but once again tossed it over the fence. That night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of children's laughter outside. Something felt off. I got up and went to the bedroom window to check. I didn't see any children, but the sound stopped. Even so, I noticed something familiar on the lawn. I put on a robe, slipped into my slippers, and went outside. It was the red ball again, in the exact same spot as before. A shiver ran down my spine. Instead of returning it, I brought it inside and left it in the living room. The night passed quietly after that. The next morning, before heading out to ski, I decided to introduce myself to the neighbor and ask about what was happening. I went to their house and knocked on the door. An elderly man, kind and seemingly harmless, answered. I asked him about the laughter and the red ball. He looked surprised and said there were no children nearby. A chill ran down my spine at his response. I thanked him. We said goodbye, and I returned to my house. I left the red ball in the living room and went off for another day of skiing with my friends. When I returned, tired and preparing to leave the next day, I didn't pay much attention to anything. I just threw my bags on the couch and went straight to bed. However, once again I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of the same laughter. I ran to the window, and to my astonishment, the red ball was back on the lawn. I rushed downstairs to check if the ball was still inside. I searched everywhere, but it was gone. To this day, I'm certain I had left it in the living room before leaving. Suddenly, a strange feeling of not being alone came over me. I turned on all the lights in the house as I hastily packed my damp clothes into my suitcase. I didn't bother folding them. I just wanted to be ready to leave if anything scarier happened. I checked everything, doors and windows all locked. It made no sense, but the unease persisted. I decided to leave the house lights on, turning off only the bedroom lights when I returned there. I approached the window and looked outside. That's when, besides the red ball sitting on the snow, I saw a figure that seemed to be a child. It was standing still, staring directly at the window where I was. I immediately ducked and hurriedly closed the blinds. Then I went around the house, shutting all the others. Despite my racing heart, I tried to calm down and ignore what I had seen. It was a long battle, but exhaustion eventually overpowered fear, and I finally fell asleep. The next morning, I skipped breakfast. I packed my things into the car as quickly as I could and left without even glancing at the red ball still on the lawn. I'd never had issues with break-ins at that house, so I didn't see any immediate reason to worry. But something kept nagging at me. How had someone managed to get inside and remove the ball from the living room without leaving any trace? Even now, the sound of children's laughter that echoed in that house haunts me. However, what left the deepest mark was that disturbing image. The child standing in the snow, in the middle of the darkness. If the ball had simply disappeared from inside the house, it would have been just a curious event. But that presence, out there in the distance, made everything far more unsettling. Before we get to the last story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing who sticks around until the end. Let's not stop now. On to the next. My name is Juliana. I grew up in a humble family on the outskirts of Guadalajara, Mexico, in a modest neighborhood where tranquility used to prevail. My father worked as a bricklayer, and my mother sold tamales on a busy corner in the city center. There were 5 of us in total: my parents, my 2 older sisters, Luisa and Rebecca, and me, the youngest. Our house was small, made of unfinished bricks, and we shared almost everything, even the mattress where we slept. The neighborhood was more than just a place to live. It was a real community. Neighbors often shared food, and in difficult times there was always someone willing to help. Near our home there was a community center run by a local church. That place was essential to us. We received food baskets, second-hand clothes, and even free medical consultations. Additionally, the center offered activities like folk dancing, computer classes, and craft workshops. To me, that place was a beacon of hope amid our tough life. Even though we had little, we never truly went hungry. There was always someone willing to offer a plate of food or a warm cup of atole. At the time, I didn't fully understand the extent of my parents' efforts to ensure the bare minimum for our family. Today, I know they sacrificed far more than they should have to give us a better future. My childhood was tough but filled with hope, especially when I saw other children learning new skills or dancing joyfully during the community center's presentations. My parents were very religious but never imposed their faith on us. To them, spirituality was something personal, something each person should discover for themselves. Despite long hours at the construction site, my father made a point of teaching us the value of hard work. My mother, with her tamale cart, showed us that although poverty was challenging, it didn't define us. When I turned 13, things took a turn for the worse. My father had an accident at work and was incapacitated for months. My mother had to work even harder to support the household with her tamale sales, but it wasn't enough. I decided I needed to do something. Inspired by a story I saw on TV about a young girl selling candy to pay for her studies, I started making mazapanis and selling them on buses. At first it wasn't easy. My candies would fall apart and many times I thought about giving up. However, with the help of the women at the community center, I learned techniques that improved my work. Gradually I gained confidence. My sisters, Louisa and Rebecca, didn't share my desire to help. To them, supporting the household was solely our parents' responsibility, but I didn't see it that way. For 2 years I sold mazapans. The money I earned not only helped at home but also allowed me to save for school supplies and clothes. Despite the hardships, we never lost our faith. My mother always said that as long as we were united, we could overcome anything. When I turned 18, I met Mateus, a young man who attended our neighborhood church. He was the pastor's assistant and had a way of speaking that conveyed confidence. Although I wasn't very present at the services, I occasionally went to thank God for my family. Mateus and I started dating, and after a year together, he proposed to me. By then, I had stopped selling mazapanis because I had found a job as a receptionist at a law office in downtown Guadalajara. This job came about thanks to an unexpected encounter. One day, while delivering mazapanis to an office, I overheard a man complaining that he couldn't access files on his computer. He was Dr. Alvarez, the owner of the office. I offered to help, recalling what I had learned in the community center's computer classes. I organized the documents and assisted with his schedule. Impressed, he offered me a permanent position, and I accepted without hesitation. This job was a turning point in my life. I learned not only about law and administration, but also grew to admire Dr. Alvarez, who, though serious, was a fair man. With my salary, I was able to help my family more and save for the future. Meanwhile, Mateus and I enthusiastically planned our wedding. He had begun building a simple house on his family's land, and even though it wasn't fully finished, we decided to get married and move there. After the wedding, we moved to his family's land, where Donato, his father, who was a pastor, also lived. Donato had very rigid ideas about the role of a married woman. To him, my place was at home, taking care of my husband and the household chores. But I never agreed with that view. I always knew I wanted to keep working, help my parents, and build a solid foundation for our life together. At first, Donato and I had many disagreements. He criticized the fact that I didn't accompany Mateus to the services and spent so much time working. But I stood firm, explaining that my faith was expressed through my actions and values, not just my physical presence at church. Mateus, for his part, always supported me. Although he preferred that I be home when he returned from work, he understood my reasons and defended me in front of his father. Over time, we found a balance. Mateus worked at a candle factory, and despite his demanding routine, he made an effort to help at home. Many times he prepared dinner while I finished my shift. Our relationship was built on love and partnership. For 5 years, we led a peaceful life, slowly shaping the future we dreamed of. During this time, Dr. Alvarez had a significant impact on my life. Even with his declining health, he continued working and refused to retire. On many occasions, I accompanied him to medical appointments and supported him through his treatments. My work hours often extended, but I never complained. I felt immense gratitude for the opportunity he had given me and was genuinely concerned about his health. When he finally decided to retire, he made sure I had a stable future by helping me secure another job at a different office. He took care to ensure I was in good hands, once again showing the generosity and fairness I always admired in him. It was during this phase that I received the news that would change our lives forever. I was pregnant. It was unexpected. Although I dreamed of being a mother someday, there were other plans I wanted to accomplish first, like studying law, a dream I had postponed to support my family and keep my job. At first, the news brought uncertainty, but it soon transformed into immense joy, hard to describe. However, this happiness was quickly overshadowed. From the early months, I began to notice something was wrong. I suffered from severe nausea, constant dizziness, and a weakness that seemed to consume me. My blood pressure was unstable, and the doctors began closely monitoring me. In the 5th month, I received the diagnosis: preeclampsia. From that point on, seizures and the risk of crises became part of my daily life. I had to leave my job and rely entirely on Mateus and my sister Louisa, who temporarily moved into our house to support us. My routine revolved around hospital visits and constant efforts to maintain my health. Despite everything, I only thought about my baby's well-being. I prayed daily, asking for strength and protection. One night, while hospitalized, I experienced something I would never forget. Mateus arrived later than usual, with a deeply disturbed expression. He told me that in the hospital corridors, he had been approached by a woman who seemed to know intimate details about our lives, things she couldn't possibly know. According to her, both the baby and I were in grave danger because dark spirits were in my room trying to take us away. She claimed the only way to save us was through a black magic ritual. Mateus, a man of faith, was shaken. The accuracy of the woman's words unsettled him, and he asked me repeatedly if I thought it could be true. I was furious but couldn't help feeling a slight chill of fear. However, my decision was firm. I rejected any notion of resorting to black magic. I clung to my faith even more. Despite this, that encounter seemed to bring a dark presence into our lives, as if it had planted a seed of doubt that began to grow. After that conversation, I noticed Mateus had changed. The calm man I knew now seemed constantly uneasy. Although he tried to act serenely, his eyes revealed an internal conflict between his belief and the fear instilled by the woman's words. A few days later, I faced a new crisis. My blood pressure rose alarmingly, and the doctors had to act urgently. During the night, while they worked to stabilize my condition, my heart stopped. For a few seconds, I was on the brink of death. I don't remember much, just flashes, frantic voices, blinding lights, and the sensation of slipping away. When I regained consciousness, I saw Mateus by my side, holding my hand tightly, tears streaming down his face. Although I survived, that episode left deep scars on all of us. The next day, the same woman appeared again at the hospital. Mateus encountered her once more in the corridor, but this time she was even more direct. She stated that if we didn't accept her proposal, something worse would happen in the coming days. There was an unsettling conviction in her words, as if she knew exactly what the future held. Mateus, increasingly shaken, shared everything with me, seeking guidance. Although I remained firm in my rejection of black magic, I couldn't ignore the frightening accuracy of her predictions. That night, I began to be plagued by nightmares. In every one of them, the woman Mateus described appeared holding my bloodied baby and staring at me with a chilling smile. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, with my heart racing. In the morning, I could barely speak of the dream without breaking into tears. These visions became recurring, growing more intense each time. My already fragile health deteriorated rapidly. Days later, I suffered another severe crisis. The doctors determined it would be extremely risky to continue the pregnancy and decided on an emergency premature delivery to try to save both my life and the baby's. As I was prepared for surgery, Mateus was in complete despair. He revealed to me that the woman had reappeared, insisting that this was our last chance. According to her, if we didn't follow her instructions, neither I nor the baby would survive. It was at that moment, overcome by fear and anguish, that Mateus gave in and decided to do what she asked, believing it was the only way to save us. After the surgery, I woke up weak, my body exhausted and my mind confused. My first thought was of the baby, but they wouldn't let me see him. He was in critical condition in the neonatal ICU. Days later, Mateus confessed what he had done. He said the woman promised she would only demand something if I survived, and he accepted, believing there was no other choice. Although I didn't support his decision, I understood the desperation that led him to it. My love for my child was so intense that in that moment I couldn't judge him. I only prayed that the price paid, whatever it was, would allow us to continue as a family. The following days were a trial by fire. Our baby, whom we named Isaac, fought for his life. However, against all odds, he began showing signs of recovery. After weeks of uncertainty in the ICU, the doctors finally gave us the news we had been waiting for. He was out of danger and would soon be with us. When I finally held him in my arms, I felt that every sacrifice had been worth it. My little Isaac was living proof that life could bloom even in the darkest situations. However, alongside the joy, there lingered a disturbing feeling. What we had done to save him had a price. And even without knowing what lay ahead, a part of me felt a deep fear of what was to come. After bringing Isaac home, it seemed like life was returning to normal. My health gradually improved, and Mateus and I tried to resume our routine. Despite the pact and everything involving that woman still weighing on our minds, we chose not to bring it up. Ignoring it seemed the only way to maintain the false sense that it had never happened. However, deep down, we both knew we couldn't escape the consequences of what we had done. In the first years, Isaac grew up healthy and full of life. He was a curious boy with contagious energy. But when he turned 5, things began to change. He started having night terrors, waking up in the middle of the night screaming that there were people in his room watching him. No matter how hard we tried to calm him, the episodes persisted, and he grew afraid of going to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he said he saw shadowy figures and heard voices calling to him. Worried, we decided to seek help. Mateus suggested turning to a pastor, but after what we had been through, I doubted anyone from the church could understand our situation. We followed a recommendation to visit a spiritual center, where a woman claimed the pact Mateus had made was the root of the problems. According to her, an entity linked to the agreement was haunting Isaac. She proposed performing a spiritual ritual to protect him, and without hesitation we agreed. For weeks we followed her instructions. For a time the terrors ceased, but the peace was brief. When Isaac turned 7, the episodes returned with even greater intensity. This time the visions didn't just happen at night. He began describing shadows in the corners of the house and footsteps following him even when he was alone. His accounts filled us with dread, but we were at a loss about what to do. Desperately, we sought help elsewhere, only to hear the same thing. The pact we had made was exacting its price, and there was no way to undo it. Rituals could be performed to ease the burden, but the entity would never leave Isaac alone. Each new attempt seemed to crush our hope further, and everyone we consulted was adamant. The promised price would be paid, sooner or later. When Isaac turned 14, the atmosphere in our home was unbearable. Mateus and I barely spoke, consumed by stress and guilt. Even without fully understanding what was happening, Isaac seemed to carry the weight of it all. That year was a trial. Every day was marked by fear, and every night a struggle for a bit of peace. On Isaac's 15th birthday, nothing happened. Weeks and months passed without any strange events. We began to believe that perhaps our efforts and prayers had worked. We even considered that the woman might have lied and that everything was just terrifying coincidences. However, that illusion was completely shattered the following year on Isaac's 16th birthday. When Isaac turned 16, something inside me stirred uneasily. We had experienced a relatively peaceful year, with no major incidents, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark still lingered around us. Mateus, always trying to reassure me, said our prayers had worked, that God was watching over us. Despite his words, part of me remained suspicious, as if I sensed that the calm was deceptive. On his birthday, Isaac went out with some school friends to hang out at the mall. It was an ordinary Saturday, seemingly without omens. I said goodbye to him with a kiss on the forehead, hiding the anxiety that consumed me. Mateus, though also anxious, tried to act casual, repeating that we had to have faith. The afternoon passed without incident, but around 7 in the evening, our world collapsed with a phone call. An unfamiliar voice informed us that Isaac and his friends had not returned home and that their phones were turned off. For a moment, my heart stopped. Mateus tried to calm me, saying it was probably just a delay, but I felt something was wrong. My intuition proved true that very night. A few hours later, the police arrived at our door with the news no parent is prepared to receive. Isaac and his two friends had been found dead in a vacant lot on the outskirts of the city. The report was unbearable. They had been brutally tortured and murdered. The authorities suggested the case might be related to gang disputes, common in the area, but I knew it wasn't just that. This wasn't a coincidence. The pain and guilt hit me with devastating force. I couldn't shake the thought that all of this was the price of the pact we had made. Mateus, though trying to appear strong, was shattered. Deep down, we both knew we had failed our son. We had done everything we could to protect him, but in the end, it wasn't enough. The following days were an indescribable torment. At Isaac's funeral, I could barely stand. Looking at that small coffin surrounded by flowers and candles felt like facing an endless nightmare. The words of comfort from friends and family couldn't fill the crushing void inside me. My mind was flooded with thoughts of everything that would never happen. Seeing him grow up, pursue his dreams, and start his own family. All of that was ripped away from us. After the burial, Mateus and I avoided talking about the pact. Simply mentioning it brought back our guilt, something unbearable to face. Each of us dealt with the pain in our own way. Mateus sought refuge in the church, clinging to the faith that had once guided him. I, on the other hand, couldn't find peace. My days were a constant effort to stay upright, while my nights were filled with nightmares that wouldn't let me rest. Over time, I began to question everything. Was it really the pact that took Isaac? Or were we just victims of a cruel and unpredictable world? There were no answers, only an incessant pain that accompanied me every moment. Despite our differences, Mateus and I stayed together. We knew no one else could understand what we were going through. However, the weight of guilt and loss was overwhelming. We lived with the bitter certainty that in some way we were responsible for our son's fate. After Isaac's death, my existence lost all purpose. Every corner of the house carried an echo of him. His laughter, the toys scattered around, the drawings left on the kitchen table. Mateus tried to console me, but I knew his pain was as unbearable as mine. Whenever we tried to talk about what had happened, silence would take over, heavy with guilt and regret. That woman and her words haunted me relentlessly. We had promised ourselves that we could escape the consequences, that our prayers and sacrifices would be enough to protect him. Yet, every memory of Isaac came with questions that seemed to scream inside me. Was it punishment for the pact, or just the cruel randomness of life? Though no answer was certain, I felt that the shadow of that agreement loomed over us. The months passed, but the emptiness only grew. Despite the support of family and friends, there was no comfort. Mateus sank into the church, seeking forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. I, on the other hand, plunged into a relentless search for answers. I visited mediums, spiritual centers, churches, and even practitioners of magic. I heard it all. Some said Isaac's soul was trapped. Others assured me he had found peace. But all these words felt hollow, incapable of easing my pain. One day, while going through Isaac's belongings, I found a notebook. Inside, he had written about his dreams and fears. Among the pages, a drawing froze me in place. It was a shadowy figure with piercing eyes. The lines were childlike, but I recognized it instantly. It was the woman from the pact. Isaac had never seen her, yet there she was, a reminder that her presence had never left us. As time passed, Mateus and I drifted apart. We grieved the same loss, but dealt with it in opposite ways. He devoted himself entirely to the church, organizing sermons and religious events, while I avoided anything related to faith. Not because I no longer believed, but because every prayer reminded me that we had failed to protect our son. My nights were a constant torment. I dreamed of Isaac, but also of that woman. In the nightmares, she mocked me, whispering that she had always known the outcome. I would wake up drenched in sweat and emptiness, my heart racing. A year after Isaac's death, Mateus suggested a memorial service in his honor. Reluctantly, I agreed, though unsure if I had the strength. During the ceremony, as the priest spoke of acceptance and faith, I felt an unexpected peace, as if for a brief moment the pressure in my chest had eased. That same night, however, something inexplicable happened. Mateus and I were looking at photos of Isaac when we heard a noise coming from his room. Since his death, the door had remained closed, untouched. With our hearts racing, we went upstairs to check. When we opened the door, the air felt dense, suffocating. On the bed lay a small folded note. Mateus picked it up, and as he unfolded it, we read a message written in an unfamiliar handwriting. The deal never ends. That message completely paralyzed us. Mateus desperately sought rational explanations, an intruder perhaps, or a cruel prank, but I knew, deep in my soul, that it was a reminder of the pact, a warning that our connection to that woman was far from over. In the days that followed, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Noises echoed through the house at night, slow footsteps in the hallway, muffled murmurs from the walls, and, on some occasions, the sound of distant crying. Mateus tried to remain composed, but the fear was evident in his eyes. As for me, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by images of Isaac and that woman. Seeking answers, I returned to one of the spiritual centers I had visited before, but this time without holding back. I recounted everything: the pact, the signs, Isaac's death, and the note left in his room. The woman who received me, an elderly lady with a frail appearance but eyes that reflected wisdom, listened intently to every word. When I finished, she took a deep breath before speaking. "A pact like this cannot be broken," she said firmly. "The forces that seal it always find a way to claim what they believe is theirs. It may take years, but they never forget." A lump formed in my throat. I asked if there was any way to stop this, to protect ourselves. She slowly shook her head, full of regret. "The only thing you can do is resist. Strengthen your faith and stand firm. But understand this: the consequences of a pact don't end with someone's death. They can haunt even future generations." Her words terrified me. Was that what it meant? That Isaac wasn't the last? That we, or even our descendants, were trapped in this cycle? When I told Mateus what the woman had said, he reacted with a mix of disbelief and indignation. "We can't let this control our lives," he declared with determination. "We need to face it, Juliana. We can't keep living like this." Though I admired his courage, I couldn't share his confidence. We had tried to fight before, and all it had brought us was the loss of our son. That night, while Mateus slept, I made a decision I had been avoiding for months. I knelt beside the bed and prayed. It had been a long time since I had done that, perhaps because I felt God had abandoned us. But in that moment of despair, I pleaded for answers, for any sign that might bring some relief. The next morning, while cleaning Isaac's room, I discovered something I had never noticed: a small notebook hidden under the mattress. As I opened it, I found drawings and notes that initially seemed random. However, as I flipped through the pages, I noticed a pattern emerging. There were repeated references to shadows, a woman with dark eyes, and something he called the Guardian. At the end of the notebook, a handwritten phrase sent chills down my spine: "They promised, and she will come to claim what is hers." That day I realized our battle was far from over. Despite all our efforts to protect Isaac, the consequences of the pact still surrounded us. What we thought was a sufficient sacrifice to save him had proven inadequate. All that was left was to wait and prepare for what was to come, even without knowing how to face it. In the following months, Mateus and I took different paths. He immersed himself in the church, seeking redemption and purpose in faith. I, on the other hand, delved into research about pacts and entities, trying to find any clue that might shed light on what we were dealing with. Despite our differences, we remained connected by something greater: our love for Isaac, and the need to prevent the horror from happening again. Although the passing days brought an appearance of normality, I knew, deep down, that we were far from free. The promise hung in the air, latent, waiting for the right moment to manifest. And even without knowing how much time we had left, every night I pray. I pray for strength, for resilience, and to face whatever is lurking when the inevitable day arrives. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.